The war on terror, declared by President George W. Bush after terrorist attacks on 9/11, which evoked many controversies, both in the United States and abroad, has been accompanied by the process of radicalization of already negative attitudes towards Arab and Muslims, both in the United States and in Europe. Subsequent events, the terrorist attacks in Madrid and London, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, recently intensified immigration from North America to European countries, the establishment of the Islamic State, and current conflict between Israel and Palestine further worsened the attitudes towards Muslims and enhanced the feeling of the threat of the other. The association with terrorism, as well as with the oppression of women, became the dominant image that permeated the media and public discourses globally, which was also accompanied by the negative perception of Islam, as, to use the words of Edward Said, anti-human, anti-democratic, and anti-Semitic. On both sides of the Atlantic, in public discussions and the media, Islam is mostly portrayed as a monolithic bloc, a closed and united group of people who are totally different from, or even intimidating and hostile to, a likewise closed West, which is Christian, secular, liberal, and democratic. The bipolar discourse, formulated along gender, racial, and religious lines, assumed the clash between good American, European, Western us and bad Muslim, Arab, other them. Islam has been commonly perceived as a violent political ideology with jihad against the West at its center, as a societal problem and a barrier for integration. There are several processes that have accompanied the war on terror and shaped its rhetoric. The issue of security, it has changed after 9/11, and now, as film critics Box and Pollard claim, for cinema and television, as for politics, the Middle East now exists as a mythical category, largely outside of time and space, a ready source of dark fears and threat. Such ideological bias has shaped public understanding of the region, as well as terrorism, for many years, before and after 9/11. In the face of the attacks in 2001, the relative marginalization of Arab Muslim communities in the media dramatically changed, and they had never been visible in public discourse on such a scale before. Consequently, as Samhan underlines, the Arab as villain has become a favorite scapegoat of popular culture, whose representation is based on dualistic logic of them versus us, that assumes incompatibility of Islam with major European and American ideas like democracy, sexual equality, rejection of violence as a means of policy, freedom of individual, etc. This echoes, I'm sure that you can think of many films and television series in which this issue can be found. In 24, we occasionally have Muslim characters as sidekicks or helpers of the main protagonist, Agent Bauer, whom he treats as assets, instrumental in getting valuable information. Throughout its 10-year airtime, the show provides numerous examples of terrorists of Muslim and Arab origin who are villains and Bauer's main opponents. The entire season 4, 6, and 8 are actually devoted to the Muslim villains. The quantity of characters does not translate into quality or diversity, of course. These characters are invariably schematic, vindictive and hateful towards the whole American nation, religiously driven, unbreakable fanatics. In the above-mentioned instances, good Muslims have very limited roles to fulfill, they suffer or even die from the hands of extremists. They are represented as either helpless to deal with fundamentalist violence or as victims of oppressive terrorist activities. This concerns women, moderate Muslims, and opponents to the Bush's war on terror. Consequently, as shown on this example, the Muslim world from homogeneous becomes disintegrated, torn by a harsh clash. However, importantly enough, it becomes unclear just where fundamentalism begins and moderate Islam ends. This blurred line makes every Muslim a potential fundamentalist and puts the burden of proof on Muslims to show that they are not fundamentalists. This unclear division is used as a narrative solution in, for example, 24, and also to a certain extent in Sleeper Cell and Homeland, when virtually all Muslim characters are sooner or later associated with terrorism. So Islamist terrorists are depicted in a very unilateral way as people who have no nationality and history, who act beyond politics and are fanatical, sadistic, so evil and irrational that no normal mode of interpretation is possible. Even their so-called cause is oftentimes a blurred idea without any explanation and justification. Their only expressed agenda is to destroy as many American lives as possible and to make them painfully suffer. They are represented as either cruel bomb manufacturers with veiled women and innocent children in the background, or as ruthless terrorists pretending to live an ordinary American middle-class life, whose women and children are directly involved in the planning and executing of terrorist activities. Such narratives that emphasize extreme form of violence on the part of the Muslim other facilitate justifying the use of violence by the good American protagonists. And I will briefly talk about it now on the example of 24 and its scenes of torture. As both the real politics and the series show, by using the argument of fear, threatened security and therefore the need for protection against enemies, both external and internal, various practices leading to subordination are legitimized and justified, including surveillance, unlawful detention, and torture. As a consequence, as Tickner underlines, Arab men and women have been subject to ethnic as well as gender profiling under the excuse that we are at war. These measures have received strong support from across the political spectrum. Criticism has been seen as unpatriotic. Dehumanization of the enemy and rejecting his or her rights serves as a perfect explanation for using torture that is performed in most of the films and television shows about terrorism. Violent methods of interrogation are permitted, but only when they are used by good American protagonists or their Muslim Arab allies for justified purpose, for example, gaining information about terrorist activity. As Boggs and Pollard claim, discourses on violence reflect the double standards permeating so much of the American public sphere. Violence is sanctioned, even celebrated, in the service of US power and wealth, but it is treated as a violation of civilized rules, of civilized values when used by others. Critics of 24 underline that shows rationalizes all kinds of violence. Designed according to a video game-like ticking time bomb scenario in a real-time format, it provides endless scenes of torture which become a key narrative solution when immediate obtaining valuable information is needed. From season 4 onwards, Bauer's torture has gone from being an infrequent shock bit to being a main thread of the plot. At least half-dozen characters have undergone interrogation under conditions that meet the conventional definitions of torture. Virtually all possible methods of torture are used in the storyline. The suspects are electrocuted, treated with chemical injection, beaten, shot, strangled with various objects, including ropes and wires. Their bones are broken, fingers cut, etc. Not only physical but also psychological violence is often used, such as blackmail or threats to kill family members. Among the suspects that are people truly or allegedly connected to terrorist activities: men, women, teenagers, politicians, diplomats, employees of the CTU, Bauer's family members, and even his fiancée in season 6. Some of these tortures are allowed for by Bauer's superiors, including the President of the United States, which, while some are his individual decision, because he's this warrior that can make his own decisions in that matter. Torture seems to be the key method to get information for CTU and its agents, among whom there are specialists in torture, such as Eric Richard, officially trained in injecting pain-inducing drugs to facilitate questioning of suspects. As Jane Mayer underlines, and I quote here, throughout the series, secondary characters, very often women or bureaucrats perceived as female, raise moral objections to abusive interrogation tactics. Yet the show never engages in a serious dialogue on the subject. Nobody argues that torture doesn't work or that it undermines America's foreign policy strategy. Instead, the doubters tend to be soft-hearted dupes, end of quote. Interestingly enough, the vast majority of these interrogations are successful and help push the plot forward. The viewers are therefore reassured that violence is not used unjustly. In innumerable sequences over the show's lengthy run, Jack can only save his country or his family by forcing information from suspected terrorists. He has only minutes, or even seconds, to get the information. Jack employs any means necessary to extract this information, and over again, he is shown to have made the right choice in restoring to these illegal tactics. The message, in other words, is that in the face of such extreme threats, torture is justified and even necessary. Do you know what is a famous quote from Jack Bauer? Just before he is about to torture somebody. Has anyone seen 24? Well, his famous quote is, "Don't make me do it." Don't make me do it. I don't want to do it to you. You are the one who want me, to do it. So there's even a clip on YouTube in which they gathered together all the instances when he actually said this phrase. Don't make me do it. 24 is an extreme, I have to admit it is an extreme example of the justification of torture and other kinds of violence. However, other shows also use it as a narrative strategy. Sleeper Cell, for starters, but even Lost. Do we have any Lost fans here? Do you remember the character of Saeed?
No.
Do you remember how many times he was asked by his colleagues to torture somebody?
Yeah, he was a professional, actually.
Exactly. He was working for the Iraqi army, right? So even in the series that are, well, seemingly not connected, right, to the war on terror, this connection is made. More recently, there are also shows that problematize and to a certain extent condemn such practices by, for example, showing the negative consequences it has not only on victims but also on perpetrators. Do we have any True Blood fans here? Do you remember the character of Terry Bellfleur? No. Well, anyway, Terry is a traumatized Iraqi war veteran, and he's haunted, literally, I mean metaphorically and literally, because it is true blood, so he can be haunted by all sorts of things, right? Is haunted by a ghost for what he had done in the line of duty. He participated in the massacre of the whole village, women and children including. I'm not going to tell you how his character ended. I don't want to spoil you because the series is ongoing, right? It's finished. I mean, it's the season 7 was the last one, right? But I haven't seen it. That's for me. It's ongoing. There is another example in Damages. Have you ever seen Damages? This is actually, Agnieszka, if you haven't seen it, this is an interesting in terms of female characters. Glenn Close is starring, right? So in Damages, in one of the seasons, there is a character of Priska Sanchez who had to face negative consequences of his deeds from Iraq when he also killed civilians, as a result of which 3 of his men were killed too. Not only has he deal with his own personal trauma and PTSD, but he also needs to find a way to prove the government conspiracy when he wants to come clean about the events he was a part of. And both Terry and Chris are certainly not Jack Bauer from 24. They are broken, traumatized, driven by guilt and fear, and having all sorts of problems because of their involvement into the war on terror. And finally, in Homeland, do you watch Homeland? This one is ongoing, right? We have Nicholas Brody, a Marine who had been first tortured and then turned by terrorists after 8 years of captivity. However, the reasons for his betrayal are pretty convincing for the viewer. While being held prisoner, he witnessed the US military action, which resulted in bombing the nearby school and the death of many children that studied there. The US government denies taking responsibility for the attacks, and the man who is responsible for giving an order runs for president. Interestingly enough, which brings me to another and the last aspect of my today's lecture. Interestingly enough, Brody is suspected of being a terrorist and finally exposed by a female CIA agent, Carrie Matheson, to whom I will return in the following parts of my lecture. And finally, let me turn to women. Another important aspect of the political rhetoric used to justify the war on terror and American intervention in Afghanistan is the use of feminist claims of protecting Muslim women's rights. Many scholars, for instance Young, claimed that, and I quote here, feminists focused on women under the Taliban constructed these women as exoticized others and paradigmatic victims in need of salvation by Western feminists, and it conveniently deflected attention from perhaps more mundane problems of gender-based violence, domination and poverty in many parts of the world, end of quote. Such a rhetoric, such an approach, civilized approach, and I use it in inverted commas, of course, approach to third world women's rights resembles the colonialist rhetoric that would justify engagement and invasion in the name of democracy, economic stability, crisis prevention, or humanitarian aid. Kaplan admits that there has been no common feminist stand towards the war on terror. And she says, we discovered that we have divergent opinions about causes of the attacks, about the US response in bombing Afghanistan, about government response within America, about European response to US action, and so on. We differed, we found, regarding what we knew or believed about women in Afghanistan, their situation vis-a-vis the Taliban, and so on. Nearly the only thing we agreed upon was the irony of George Bush's claiming that bombing Afghanistan would be liberating for Afghan women. End of quote. So the Muslim world, which has been traditionally perceived as underdeveloped, irrational, weak, backward, driven by violence and conflict, and symbolized by, among others, the suppression of women, was at length discussed in Orientalism by Said. I hope that you know this book. What Said did not problematize was Western feminist uneasy alliance with the so-called third world women. As the post-colonial feminist Chandra Mohanty underlines, Western feminists too often use this general, homogeneous category which refers to third world women as passive and victimized by their barbarous, oppressive cultures and tradition. Such an approach resonates not only in the US, of course, but also, for example, in France, where a famous debate about the unveiling of Muslim women took place. Indeed, as Tickner says, if we did see women, they were likely to be faceless Afghan women in the now familiar blue burqa. Their shadowy and passive presence seemed only to reinforce these gendered images. Naturally, it is politically safer and there is less risk in portraying women as victims than in supporting their empowerment. The image of helpless victims behind the veil may be politically less risky than supporting articulate, forceful advocates of women's rights. Moreover, it is difficult for Western women to understand that burqa or veil is oftentimes not perceived by Muslim women themselves as oppression, that they do not want to be saved. I have a quotation here from a member of the Revolutionary Association of the Women of Afghanistan, RAVA. No woman that was met by the interviewer on her mission in Afghanistan complained about burqa. Rather, they described the insult of their daily lives and the theft of their identities. The lack of education, for example, was one of the issues that was mentioned. They rather emphasized their desire for peace, healthcare, education, food, shelter, and most of all, the freedom of choice about their future clothing lives and lifestyle. Consequently, these misconceptions eliminate any possibility for dialogue and mutual understanding, while ignoring the complexity of experiences of Muslim or Arab women only fuels erroneous assumptions that they are victimized homogeneous group, instead of looking at them as constantly changing, diversified, and often representing contradictory views on their religion, position within the community, relationship with men and women's rights. As Faza Hiri makes clear, she is another scholar who actually looks at Muslim representations in television series. In all of the portrayals that existed then and exist now, there appears to be an undercurrent that suggests that Muslim women are especially different from a Western-defined norm, ignoring the reality that the Western legacy of androcentrism and misogyny, through differing in its specificities, is nevertheless, generally speaking, no better than of other cultures, including the Islamic. So it is clear by now that television series have been instrumental not only in mobilizing fear and legitimizing pro-security activities, but also in defining the dominant gender roles in this discourse: the real men, frontiersmen, heroes, and victims, passive women deprived of any independence and decision-making. Alternatively, women that have any kind of agency are those who sympathize or ally with the Muslim male other, the bad women who refuse to be protected or reject the need of protection. These women at first manage to threaten the protector and those whom he protects, but often strategically using their femaleness as a clever disguise to surprise. However, they usually are disciplined, some more painfully than others. For example, the Dutch woman in sleeper cell is killed after she managed to murder the protector's girlfriend. And the female terrorist in Homeland is captured by the CIA and forced to cooperate. Seasons 2 and 4 of 24 also offer such representations. There is the character of Dina in season 4, who is another ruthless killer dedicated to her cause, willing to make almost any sacrifice. She and her husband are loyal to a dangerous Islamist group, but there is no real cause that is articulated and explained. Being Middle Eastern or Muslim seems to be the explanation enough for the various murders committed by Dina and her family members. Dina does redeem herself to a certain extent, but only when pressured, when her son, also involved in terrorist activity, is in danger. Nonetheless, as any character like her, she meets an ultimate end. She is killed. And I do have a clip. I wanted you to see this clip because it really gives us, an interesting kind of gender dynamic between the American female protagonist and the Muslim female protagonist, and this is definitely something new. And although Dalia was defeated in a way because she was just she was subordinated as in previous instances, but nonetheless her character was actually quite developed and quite nuanced in comparison to what 24 offered us earlier on. I really have to finish, and to sum up, I have other clips and other examples. Maybe we can use them during the discussion. But before I do that, to sum up, I want to refer to the recent television production Homeland, which in my opinion, and I do know that maybe you will be critical of this opinion, and I'm actually counting on it, but in my opinion has some sort of potential in fulfilling the goal of, for example, of destabilizing this logic of the war on terror, in which the courage is necessarily connected with violence on the one hand, but also in which it offers an interesting examples of cooperation between the female agent, played by Claire Danes, and other agents, also Muslim women. The main protagonist, Carrie Mathison, is an excellent, as you know, intelligent, but at the same time a very unpredictable and unappreciated by her superior CIA operative. She is also sick. She suffers from a bipolar disorder, which complicates her life, both professional and private. But at the same time, it is her blessing, right? It gives her unique, genius-like intuition into the war on terror mysteries. Her courage, I claim, is totally different from that of Jack Bauer from 24, or even Darwin Al-Said from Sleeper Cell. I didn't talk much about Sleeper Cell, but it's an interesting show for you to see. And of course, I think her character could be easily criticized from a feminist perspective. She is a mad, at times hysterical, spontaneous woman, too emotional, too unstable to be a reliable character to push the plot forward, especially concerning such serious issues as the war on terror and national security. And I have to admit it, she's a very difficult person to like, especially as the show progresses. Also, probably due to the fact that a lot of the things she does can be stereotypically perceived as very unwomanly. She likes random sex, she likes dangerous sex with the person whom he suspects to be a terrorist. She drinks her bipolar, anti-bipolar pills together with a bottle of Chardonnay. She can be really mean and bossy. She abandons her few-month-old baby, and finally, in the later season, in the last season, she seduces a teenager and has sex with him in order to turn him. So, and I guess she's also more than willing to sacrifice her own people in the pursuit of terrorists. I guess she considers them collateral damage. I perceive Carrie differently, and regardless of a growing criticism over her character, I still like her. She is in power, she's ahead of all the fellow male CIA agents. She sees things and connections that no one else is able to see. And she most of all relies on her Muslim and non-Muslim female informants, who are given enormous, in comparison to other productions, agency. Her relationship with them is based on mutual trust, and these are their actions that push the plot forward. And furthermore, in season 3 and 4, we have a new character of Farah, a financial analyst who helps trace terrorist money. Farah is gaining more and more importance this season, in season 4, and hopefully will provide a much more nuanced representation of a Muslim woman. And I believe that this is certainly a completely novel narrative in post-9/11 television landscape, and meets the expectations of some feminists, for example Kaplan, who insists that film and television should make an effort to pose the question as to whether women from such opposed groups and national locations and ethnic and religious background can overcome those differences. So far, the responses to this question have been rather negative, as shown in 24 and Sleeper Cell. Therefore, Carrie and Farah at least have the potential, I guess, to transgress stereotypes, false assumptions, and mutual animosities resulting from the cultural and religious backgrounds. And I will show you, just to close my talk, I will show you a clip of Farah, okay? So that you could see the difference. Have you noticed the difference between Farah in the first clip and the second one?
She's empowerment, comparing to the first scene, and she's got also some makeup, and she's without her.
Yeah, well, so the first thing is that she stood up, right? She and quite rightly, because this is actually due to her activities that this operation was even possible. So this is one thing, but another thing is that she doesn't wear a scarf anymore. I mean, she wears it because it takes place in Islamabad, so she wears it when she's on operation outside of the embassy, but she stopped using the scarf inside of the embassy, which is a difference. We will see how it develops, but in season 4, she was always wearing a scarf when she was inside of the CIA. So, it can be interpreted, in 2 different ways. Is she becoming simply more moderate? Because this is actually, I didn't talk about it much, but the sign, if you are a fundamentalist or a moderate Muslim, is also associated with how one looks, right? So it is assumed that when a woman is wearing traditional clothing, you know, she's not moderate, right? She's not westernized. So, you know, this comes from, I think, the recent episode from 2 weeks. We have to see how her character develops, but nonetheless, this is probably the first time ever that we have a woman in a scarf on the main cast of the TV series, right, after 9/11. So this is an interesting development.